Hey, what's up folks? Tobin. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about CSS and less and Sass and stylus and cssnext and all that style your page kind of shit. The thing about CSS is that it's really not very good. It's for all kinds of reasons. There's no real scoping, there's no real modularization. There's nothing programmatic about it. You can't even put in a variable. It's just a pile of not very good. And that's why less and Sass and stylus and things like that came about. It's to give CSS some kind of functionality to it that a programmer really needs to have. I resisted using any of the preprocessors for a long time for a couple reasons. One, preprocessing creeps me out a little bit. I don't like the idea of stuff going from one kind of language to another kind of thing, and that's what's running and has to be debugged. You end up with things not working quite the way you think they should, and debugging really isn't all that hard because it's pretty easy to see where things are coming from, especially if you're using source maps. But it's something I resisted for a long time. The other thing is it doesn't do anything that CSS doesn't do. It just does it in a nicer way for a programmer. Which, writing your stuff in a non-standard way for that seemed like didn't quite meet the bar I need to not go with the standards. But CSS is so bad I ended up using less, and even just having variables is just awesome. So I've been using less for all my projects for a little while now, and then I ran across a really good article I'll link to. It's very funny, called On Writing Real CSS Again. And it talks about how you can use some tooling to write in the next version of CSS, although there is no next version, with future capabilities of CSS, and that will supplant a lot of the things you are using less and Sass and stylus for. So you can write to the future standards right now, and then in the future you can just stop transpiling it to current CSS. So you're future-proofing your code and you're using the standard, and all that sounded very cool to me. So I tried it out, and now I'm using it on a project, and I think this is what I'm going to be using from now on. So this screencast is going to be a little on the dull side because we're just going to be writing and running little bits of code so you can kind of see how it works. But it'll be fun. So I've got a folder with just a few things in it: a main CSS file, a CSS module, and it's going to be transpiled from cssnext to today's version of CSS. It's doing, I should talk a bit about CSS versions. CSS, like HTML, is no longer released in major versions, like there isn't a CSS 3 or a CSS 4. Each part of CSS is its own little module, and it's released and browsers adopt it as it becomes ready. So it's kind of like a continual progress kind of thing. Not like I'm coding to the CSS version 4. Well, there's not really any such thing. You're just using a lot of modules that are associated with future stuff. To do that, we're using a couple tools. One is called postcss. Postcss is a JavaScript processor for manipulating CSS. It's really a framework for having modules that manipulate CSS and JavaScript. It's a very big project. It's the folks that did AutoPrefixer do PostCSS. Lots of people use it. It's very, very fast. It's faster than less, which means, of course, it's faster than Sass, because unless you're running libsass, Sass is a slow pony. And it's a framework you put other modules into. And one of the modules we're going to put into it is called cssnext. cssnext is a module that is what is going to convert our future CSS to current CSS. So we can do things like have you know, selectors and special selectors and variables and all kinds of cool stuff. So that's what we're using. Look at our gulp file. You'll see the node modules I installed. There's gulp, of course, to run our tasks. Gulp postcss, there's our postcss. And we're running 3 different modules for postcss. Auto prefixer. Auto prefixer is something you should just always have, no matter what you're doing. What it does is you tell it what browser versions you want to support, and it automatically puts in prefixes for stuff you need. So instead of writing -moz -box shadow and -webkit -box shadow and -ms -box shadow and what's opera? O -box shadow and then box shadow, you can just write box shadow and the browsers you want to support, and it'll put that other stuff in if it needs to. So it saves you from a lot of boilerplate kind of typing. PostCSS import. This is a module for PostCSS that where it sees a @import in your CSS file, it'll go grab that import and it'll stick it right in your file there. So it's a way you can handle modularization in your CSS code. So you can have 8 or 9 different modules. This module can call this module that calls this module. And it'll string all that stuff together for you into one file, which is what you have to do for performance reasons. So that handles your modularization, and cssnext is going to handle all of our future-y CSS stuff. We'll set up a task for CSS, and we'll make an array for our different processors for PostCSS. Our add import, our auto prefixer. I'm going to tell it to get the last 2 versions of every major browser. The browser setting for auto prefixer can be as complicated or as simple as you want. You could say last 2 versions and then say IE 9 and then say iOS 5, Android 4. You can have a long string there and it'll figure all that out and prefix your CSS as needed. And then here's our cssnext. If you go to cssnext page, I'll link to it, you'll see there's a bunch of different options for it that you can put in or set, you know, toggle them to true so it'll read through your CSS and transpile those over. Here I'm just using 3. I'm using custom properties, custom selectors, and color functions. Custom properties is variables and stuff. Custom selectors, well, you'll see how all this works. Now, our actual task is just taking our main CSS and running it through PostCSS with our processors and then spitting it back out into this compiled folder. So here's what our main CSS file looks like. I'm doing an import here. I'm importing this module 1 CSS. And here I'm setting a variable. I'm just setting a color. Call it variable 1 because I'm not very creative. Here's just this, you know, badass green. You can do scoping at all kinds of different levels for variables in the next version of CSS. Right now, cssnext only supports root scoped variables, I think. So we're setting a variable for green, and this is how you use a variable. In the next, in future capabilities of CSS, you go var, and variables have this dash in front of it. So it's a little bit wordier than, say, your @ and then a variable and less. But on the other hand, @ or a $sign is kind of confusing, especially in @ because you use that for other stuff in regular CSS. And here you can see you're definitely using a variable here. That's how we use a variable. We're importing the color functions module, which means I can take that color and I can make it lighter or darker or change the hue or alpha or saturation. This is really handy. You can set one base color and then manipulate it a few times in other places. And then I can change that one base color and then that manipulation goes all throughout your code. Now we have a div over here, and this dash heading is our kind of custom selector. And this is being set in our module 1. So if we look over in module 1, all it's doing really, this custom selector is just saying, and we're calling it, it's like kind of like a variable, -- heading, and we're giving it h1 through h6 heading tags. And here we're going div -- heading blue. What that's going to do when it gets transpiled is div h1, div h2, div h3, div h4. Because module 1 is getting imported before, that's what it turns out to be, before right at the top, that variable is going to be available in the rest of our code. So when we go upstairs and we transpile that rather, and you see postcss is very, very fast, we'll see it goes, here's our main file, and that's getting this comment here, and here's our import. You'll see our comment from our import. Hi there, it's going to write that. And here's from our module 1, which is right at the top. This div -- heading comes out like this, which is exactly how you need to do it in regular CSS. You see this P color, it's substituted this variable right there for regular CSS can use it. And for this A link, where we've lightened it by 90%, you can see this is a much lighter green color now. It's doing it as RGB. And down here at the bottom where we sent our custom selector of heading to font weight bold, goes div h1 through h6 font weight bold. And there's a lot of other really cool stuff in the next version, custom media queries, things like that. In the next version of, future capabilities of CSS that you can toggle on in postcss and cssnext and write that CSS today. So you'll be writing with future capabilities and all the advantages. It'll still work today. And in the future, all you have to do is just turn off your pre-processing because you won't need it anymore. You won't be in a situation where maybe less has had a major new release and some old stuff is broken, or you're not coding it in some other non-standard thing to get to the standard thing. You're coding it with the standards, and you're just transpiling it to where the capabilities are today for the browsers you support. So that's it. That's postcss and cssnext, and how you can use it and why I'm going to start using this stuff today rather than less Sass and stylus. It's really cool. It lets you do modular code. It lets you do variables. It lets you do custom selectors and all kinds of really neat stuff. So check it out. I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.